Did the Pope cite established Catholic dogma on the just war theory by a
You're
prominent state?
questioning the
He
Pope
did.
citing?
Yes. Yeah, I am actually.
Catholic
You're allowed
dogma?
to. You're allowed to do that.
Well, look, and then so did J.D. Vance.
So this is one of those panels where somebody walked in thinking they were going to have a normal political debate and walked out looking completely ridiculous. We have Joe Belli on the show with S.E. Cupp and the rest of the panel, and honestly, what happens here is just something else. Joe Belli ties himself into knots, trying to defend everything Trump does, and the rest of the panel is just not having it at all. Let me break this down for you piece by piece.
Hey there, I'm Sarah Seidner in New York. America has a come-to-Jesus moment of sorts, but in politics, after a week of surreal events involving the Trump administration using religion to hit back at scrutiny of its war with Iran. The president deleted a picture depicting himself as Jesus after a bipartisan backlash.
I thought it was me as a doctor and had to do with Red Cross as a Red Cross. It's supposed to be me as a doctor making people better.
He posted another picture, this time of the two hugging. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth likened Trump to Jesus, calling reporters the enemies of Christ.
As the passage ends, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel against him, how to destroy him. I sat there in church and I thought, our press are just like these Pharisees.
Hegseth wasn't the only one who compared Trump to Christ.
I believe that Donald Trump is better than sliced bread. I think he's almost the second coming, in my humble opinion.
And in a twist, a Hollywood script entered the chat when Hegseth used a classic Tarantino movie quote during a prayer.
We often look somewhere else and look at trials through the wrong lens, and Jesus understands what kind of recipe we need for his purpose. Which leads me finally to a prayer that I'll read, which was also handed to me a couple of days ago.
So the whole situation starts because the Trump administration has been mixing religion and politics in the most obvious and embarrassing way possible. We are talking about Trump posting a picture of himself looking like Jesus. Pete Hegseth comparing Trump to Jesus in front of cameras. And then on top of all that, Hegseth stands up at a military event and reads what he calls a prayer, and it turns out to be a quote, straight out of Pulp Fiction, a Quentin Tarantino movie, at a military prayer session. You honestly cannot make this stuff up.
The Pentagon says Hegseth used a quote given to him by pilots involved in the rescue of the airmen in Iran. This was just the backdrop to a holy war of words between the Vatican and the United States. The president picked fights with the Pope after Leo called for peace and an end to the violence and warned about tyrants using religion for military gain. Trump's allies then began to lecture the Vatican.
I think it's very, very important for the Pope to be careful when he talks about matters of theology. You've got to make sure it's anchored in the truth.
The Pope needs to keep his business into leading his flock, so to speak, leading the church, and probably stay out of the political arena.
A pontiff or any religious leader can say anything they want, but obviously if you wade into political waters, I think you should expect some political response, and I think the Pope's received some of that.
So at this point, suddenly Republicans don't want religion in politics. Now to our table, what's with the holy war? I guess first to you, Joe.
Well, look, going to the Pope, I think Speaker Johnson's comments were probably the best. If the Pope is going to use his office and his place as not just a religious head, but as a head of state to engage in politics, you should expect some incoming back. And I'm actually, I think back to Pope Pius VII in World War II, who gets criticized for not speaking up against Nazi atrocities, the genocide against Jews. And I am wondering why the Pope doesn't make more stronger statements against what's happening within Iran, within the regime, the behavior that they've exemplified over the last 40 years. Look, I'm not saying, the situations are the same, but it is weird to have a pope only taking the side of Iran and not criticizing them for their atrocities.
It probably is not fair to say he's taking the side of Iran. He is quoting
takes the side of peace.
If you're taking one side,
quoting scripture, and he's talking about peace.
Trump's mic drop moment was when he was asked about 4 protesters Iran is going to plan to kill over the next day or two, and he said, ask the Pope. And he's right, the Pope has not weighed in on that. So to have the Pope weigh in, look, there is a long Catholic tradition of popes weighing in on politics. We expect the Pope to weigh in on peace, to support peace. I expect the Pope even to weigh in on the migrant crisis and things like that. But you have a war that's prosecuted against the number one state sponsor of terrorism, a state that uses its proxies to murder innocent civilians everywhere, a state that has murdered, by conservative estimates, 30,000 people within the last year. Maybe save the outrage for them, Your Eminence.
So, render unto Caesar.
Now the Pope steps in and says God does not bless conflict and calls for peace. Pretty simple statement, right? Nothing crazy. Just a religious leader talking about peace. But suddenly all these Republicans who spent years screaming about religion in public life are now telling the Pope to stay in his lane and keep out of politics. The same people who want the 10 Commandments in every classroom are now saying a religious leader should not talk about war and peace. The hypocrisy is just staggering. And then Joe Belli does what Joe Belli always does. He starts bringing up World War II and Iran being a state sponsor of terrorism and all of that. But here's the thing, nobody on that panel let him get away with it. Because World War II happened because America was directly attacked. Japan attacked the United States. That's why America got involved. Iran did not attack America. This was a choice, a deliberate offensive decision. So comparing the two is just completely dishonest, and the panel called him out on it immediately.
Right? I mean, this is the ultimate underlying point. All of a sudden, we see the Trump administration trying to misuse faith for political purposes almost every day, including the posts of the president comparing himself to Jesus. And yet when the Pope actually talks about New Testament values of promoting peace against a preemptive war, which is not a condoning what executions in Iran at all, then all of a sudden he's on the wrong side of the politics. And so he gets demonized. And they basically say, shut up and dribble.
Do you think Iran's not responsible for proxy wars that have been existing for 40 years?
Of course they do. But that's like literally nothing to do with the larger
nothing
point.
To do. Come on.
Literally nothing.
Nothing?
Literally
That's
nothing
a stretch,
to do with it.
John,
No, Joe, no,
nothing?
no.
Come on.
Look, here's why. When you get Pete Hegseth, who misquotes the Bible by quoting from a fake verse, pious and bringing religion into the Pentagon every day, quoting something from Pulp Fiction, it's a perfect encapsulation of the problem. They're trying to weaponize faith. They're trying to weaponize faith and fundamentally misunderstand it. And that's the endemic problem.
Trump doesn't understand religion or Christianity. He has no fluency with it. It's not a second, third, fourth language. He doesn't know it at all. And what he didn't get was that Catholics are very different from evangelicals. And Catholics only voted for Trump by 50% in 2016, 55% in 2024. And Catholics' read on the Bible is very different from an evangelical worldview. In evangelicalism, you've got prosperity theology, you've got preachers who say, give me millions of your dollars so that I can live in a big mansion. Catholics eschew that. And so to see Trump and Hegseth's and J.D. Vance's interpretation of the Bible and Jesus and Scripture being so sacrilegious turns off Catholics in a way it does not necessarily turn off evangelicals. And to lose a Catholic base when he's already losing among independents, among young people, among men, among Hispanics, he just can't afford it.
Go ahead.
Call me old-fashioned. I harken back to a time where we talked about the separation of church and state. I don't want it's in the Constitution, by the way. I don't want our leaders promoting any religion. I'm not a Christian, but I don't think my religion's better than any other religion. I don't think Christianity's better than any other religion. The military, by the way, has people of all religions. Muslims, by the way, which the president insulted horrendously just a week ago. And just think about our opponents, the Iranians. That's a theocracy. Yep. That's what we're against.
That's what we don't want.
Essie Cupp makes a point that just cuts right through everything. She says, look, we are supposed to be a secular country. Separation of church and state is literally in the Constitution. The military has people of every religion, Christians, Muslims, people of all faiths serving together. And now you have the Secretary of Defense turning military events into religious ceremonies and quoting Pulp Fiction as scripture. Meanwhile, the actual Pope talks about peace and they tell him to be quiet. It is completely backwards.
We're for pluralism, we're for democracy, we're for people having whatever religion they want, but not making it part of our military or our government, because that's not what America is.
Because we were talking about support and what's going on, I want you to listen to what we're hearing from some folks who were big Trump supporters. Take a listen, and you mentioned Benny Johnson. He happens to be in this as well.
It's completely inappropriate, and he knows it. I don't know why the president's getting so desperate for attention that he feels the need to mock 1.4 billion Catholics. It's enough, okay? It's enough with this nonsense.
I'm also offended when anyone projects themselves as Christ.
We should not have a president who gleefully blasphemes the faith of, by far, the vast majority of his supporters.
Joe, do you think this was a mistake? Just a big, ugly mistake?
I think the president thought it was a mistake, and certainly I do. He took it down. That was the right thing to do.
But then he lied about it.
Look. You know, last week the gospel was about doubting Thomas, and doubting Thomas is the guy who had to, see it to believe it. You said that Catholics were abandoning Donald Trump. I was at a Catholic gala. Yeah, you literally said Catholics were abandoning.
No,
5 minutes. We could run the tape. You said Catholics are abandoning Donald Trump, not in the same way evangelicals are. So
no, I said Catholics are more offended than evangelicals are.
I was at a Catholic gala last night. I go to church. My kids play in Catholic leagues. I don't know one Catholic who was a Trump supporter. I'm not saying there aren't, but who was a Trump supporter who was that offended about the picture, or
you just saw a bunch of them on screen.
Or that offended. I'm saying Catholics. Or that offended by. what Trump has done vis-a-vis Iran with respect to what the Pope's criticism was, and is now not supporting the president. I don't know one. Honestly, I do not know one.
But yeah,
So
the Pope's,
we just played some.
You're taking they would rather take Donald Trump, the president, over the Pope, the leader of the church.
Pope polls way better than Donald Trump.
The Pope, I think the Pope is wrong for criticizing America without criticizing the Iranian regime. I think
Isn't
that's
that just about?
I think that's
but
you know,
do you
we think the Pope
he's
speaks
accusing
ex
the Iranian
cathedra and
regime?
is infallible on very certain matters. The Pope can be wrong about a lot of things. This happens to be one of them.
But he is talking about peace, and that could be to everyone, right? I mean, when you say peace could be...
He criticized people for tyrants dropping bombs. I mean, that was a direct
He said
attack.
God doesn't bless conflict.
Why did you feel
Period. He didn't say God doesn't bless U.S. conflict or God doesn't bless Iranian. He said God doesn't bless conflict.
Correct.
There is nothing more anodyne than what the Pope said about war and peace.
St. Augustine has a just war theory, which war is just. This is Catholic tradition.
The Iran war doesn't apply to
Did the Pope cite established Catholic dogma on the just war theory by a
You're
prominent state?
questioning the
He
Pope
did.
citing?
Yes. Yeah, I am actually.
Catholic
You're allowed to.
dogma?
You're allowed to do that.
Well, look, and then so did J.D. Vance.
Yes, he did.
And look, I'm all about just war theory, but somehow I think the objection isn't about misapplication of just war theory and more about criticizing a preemptive war.
By the way, this was the conversation at St. Agnes's Church after Mass this week in Naples, Florida. Just for the record, we were talking about this.
Well, God,
We're talking about this.
With other people, yes.
well, God, if she does exist, I don't think supports war in any form.
I love the parable when the Secretary of War goes out, cheats on his wives, gets wasted, and then quotes Pulp Fiction. That's my favorite parable from the New Testament.
And we will end this part of the show there. Next, more and more MAGA Republicans.
And here's something really important that the panel brings up. Catholics and evangelicals are not the same. Trump seems to think they are, but they are very different. Evangelical prosperity preachers tell their followers to give millions so they can live in mansions. That is not how Catholics think at all. Catholics only voted for Trump by around 50% in 2016 and 55% in 2024. That is not a dominant number. And when you start blaspheming the Pope, who polls way better than Trump, by the way, you are not just offending a small group. You are pushing away a massive part of your own base at a time when you are already losing independents, young people, and Hispanics. Even some of Trump's biggest supporters are starting to talk up about this. People who have been defending him for years are now saying this is too far. Mocking 1.4 billion Catholics is not a smart political move. Taking down the Jesus picture was the right call, but then lying about why it was posted in the first place just made everything worse. You cannot post something like that and then pretend it meant something else. Nobody is buying that explanation. And the funniest part of this whole thing is watching Joe Belli try to criticize the Pope for not being tough enough on Iran while defending an administration that is quoting Pulp Fiction during military prayers and posting pictures of the president as Jesus. Like, at what point do you just stop and listen to yourself? The panel completely ganged up on him, and honestly, he deserved every single bit of it. Essie Cupp was just laughing at how ridiculous the whole thing had become, and honestly, that was the most reasonable reaction in the room. Bottom line here is pretty simple. You cannot weaponize religion every single day for political purposes and then turn around and tell the actual leader of the Catholic Church to stay out of politics. You cannot quote Pulp Fiction at military prayer sessions and then lecture the Pope about theology. And you cannot compare a war of choice to World War II and expect people with half a brain to just nod along and agree with you. The panel saw right through all of it. Joe Belli had no real answer, and Essie Cupp, laughing at the end, said everything that needed to be said. Let me know in the comments whose side you are on. Are you with Essie Cupp and the panel, or do you think Joe Belli had a point? Drop your thoughts below and make sure you like and subscribe for more breakdowns like this.